The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of a weathered homestead, dust swirling around the wheels as Temperance Taylor clutched her small valise and peered anxiously through the window. After 3 months of correspondence and a grueling 2-week journey across the frontier, she had finally arrived in Copper Creek, Colorado, to meet her future husband. But instead of the welcoming committee she'd imagined, the first thing that caught her eye was the simple pine coffin resting on sawhorses near the porch. The year was 1875, and at 23, Temperance had made the difficult choice to leave behind her dwindling prospects in Boston following her parents' deaths. The advertisement had seemed like Providence. Established rancher seeks educated, respectable woman as wife. Comfortable home provided. The letters from Patrick Quaid had been straightforward but kind, describing his ranch and expressing his desire for companionship. Now, as she stepped down from the coach on trembling legs, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. A tall man emerged from the shadow of the porch, his face partially obscured by a worn Stetson. His shoulders were broad beneath a faded blue shirt, and he moved with the easy grace of someone accustomed to hard work. When he lifted his face, Temperance saw eyes the color of a stormy sky and a face weathered by sun and wind. "Miss Taylor." His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Yes, Mr. Quaid." Temperance's voice quavered as she glanced again at the coffin. He followed her gaze, then pushed his hat back on his head. "I'm Patrick Quaid." He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "There's been a complication." The driver tossed her trunk down from the top of the coach. "Need anything else, miss?" "No, thank you," she murmured, unable to tear her eyes away from the coffin. The stagecoach pulled away, leaving her stranded in a swirl of dust with a stranger and a coffin between them. "Who?" she began, gesturing weakly toward the pine box. "My brother Thomas," Patrick said, his voice flat. "Took a fever 3 days ago. Nothing Doc Miller could do." He cleared his throat. "I sent word to the stage company to tell you not to come, but I reckon it didn't reach you in time." Temperance's heart sank. "Your brother? But I thought—" Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and confusion. The letters were signed Patrick Quaid. "Thomas used my name." He ran a hand over his face. "I never knew about you until yesterday, when he told me everything before he—" Patrick gestured toward the coffin. He didn't think any woman would agree to marry a man with a crippled leg and a face scarred from the war. Temperance felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The man she'd corresponded with was dead, and she was standing before his brother, a stranger with nowhere to go and barely enough money for a meal, let alone a return ticket to Boston. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Quaid," she said stiffly, struggling to maintain her composure. "Perhaps you could direct me to the nearest hotel until I can arrange passage back east." Patrick Quaid studied her for a long moment. "Nearest hotel's in Red Rock, 20 miles from here." His gaze softened slightly. "You'll stay with me." "I beg your pardon?" Temperance stepped back, shocked by his blunt statement. "It's not proper." "Wasn't asking," Patrick interrupted. "Night's coming, and there's nowhere else. Mrs. Wilkes from the neighboring farm is inside. She'll be your chaperone until we figure things out." He took a deep breath. "Thomas wanted you here. Least I can do is offer you shelter while you decide what to do next." Temperance looked from the coffin to the house to the dusty road that disappeared over the horizon. She had nowhere to go, no family waiting for her return. With reluctance, she nodded. "Very well, Mr. Quaid. But only until I can make other arrangements." Patrick picked up her trunk with ease. "Fair enough. Funeral's tomorrow." He started toward the house, then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Taylor, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing." Temperance watched him climb the porch steps, his left leg dragging slightly the war injury his brother had mentioned. She glanced back at the empty road, then at the coffin, and finally at the weathered farmhouse that was to have been her new home. With a deep breath, she followed Patrick Quaid into the unknown. The house was simple but clean, with a large kitchen and sitting room downstairs and what she presumed were bedrooms above. A plump, gray-haired woman looked up from the stove as they entered. "Mrs. Wilkes, this is Miss Taylor," Patrick said, setting down the trunk. "Miss Taylor, Mrs. Wilkes has agreed to stay with us through the funeral." "Oh, you poor dear," Mrs. Wilkes exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "What a terrible shock this must be for you. Come, sit down. I've made stew, and there's fresh bread." Temperance allowed herself to be led to the table, grateful for the woman's kindness. As she sat, she noticed Patrick watching her with an unreadable expression before he turned away to wash at the basin by the door. "I've prepared the spare room for you," Mrs. Wilkes said quietly. "It's small but comfortable." "Thank you," Temperance murmured, still trying to absorb the reality of her situation. Dinner was a quiet affair, with Mrs. Wilkes carrying most of the conversation. Patrick ate silently, occasionally glancing at Temperance when he thought she wasn't looking. After the meal, he excused himself to finish preparations for the funeral, leaving her alone with Mrs. Wilkes. "He's a good man," the older woman said as they washed the dishes together. "Rough around the edges, but good-hearted. Came back from the war changed, like so many did, but he's kept this place going despite everything." "What happened to his leg?" Temperance asked. "Sharpsburg. Minnie ball shattered his knee. He was lucky to keep the leg at all." Mrs. Wilkes shook her head. "Thomas was the talker of the two, always full of charm and stories. Patrick's the quiet one, but he's the backbone. Always has been." Temperance thought about the letters she'd received, filled with descriptions of the land and hopes for the future. Had Thomas written them, or had Patrick unknowingly penned the words that had drawn her across the country? She didn't know what to believe anymore. That night, alone in the small bedroom, Temperance wept silently, for the hopes she'd carried, for the future she'd imagined, and for the stranger who lay in a coffin outside her window. When exhaustion finally claimed her sleep was restless and filled with confused dreams. The funeral took place the following afternoon, with neighbors from miles around gathering to pay their respects. Temperance stood slightly apart, feeling like an intruder in their grief. Patrick stood stoic by the grave as the preacher spoke words of comfort, his face a mask of controlled emotion. Only once, when they lowered the coffin into the ground, did she see that mask slip, revealing a flash of raw pain before he composed himself again. Afterward, people brought food to the house and spoke in hushed voices about Thomas Quaid, his humor, his kindness, his way with horses. Temperance listened, building a picture of the man she'd thought she would marry, wondering how much of the person they described matched the one who had written to her. As the sun began to set, the last of the mourners departed, leaving her alone with Patrick and Mrs. Wilkes. The older woman began packing her things. "You're not staying?" Temperance asked, trying to hide her panic. "My husband needs me at our farm," Mrs. Wilkes explained apologetically. "But Patrick says Pastor Evans in town has found a place for you with the schoolteacher's family until you decide what to do next." Temperance looked at Patrick, who was staring out the window at the fresh mound of earth in the distance. "When would I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he answered without turning. "I'll take you in the wagon." That night, after Mrs. Wilkes had gone to her room, Temperance found herself unable to sleep. She crept downstairs for a glass of water and found Patrick sitting at the table, a lamp burning low beside him as he read through what appeared to be letters. He looked up as she entered, quickly gathering the papers. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, hesitating in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep either?" His voice was softer than she'd heard it before. Temperance shook her head, moving to the water bucket to fill a cup. In the dim light, she could see that his eyes were red-rimmed. "Were those my letters?" she asked suddenly, nodding toward the papers he'd tucked away. Patrick looked startled, then nodded slowly. "Found them in Thomas's things, trying to understand what he was thinking." "And do you understand?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Thomas always wanted things he couldn't have. A normal life after the war. A wife who wouldn't look at his scars with pity. He shrugged. "When he saw your advertisement in the Marriage Gazette, he thought maybe he could have that, at least." "My advertisement?" Temperance frowned. "But I responded to Mr. Quaid's advertisement, not the other way around." Patrick's brow furrowed. He reached for the stack of papers again, shuffling through them until he found what he was looking for. This one? "Educated Boston lady of good character seeks husband in Western Territories. Willing to work hard and adapt to frontier life." Temperance stared at the clipping. "Yes, that's mine. But I received a letter in response. Signed Patrick Quaid." "Thomas used my name," Patrick explained again. "But he answered your advertisement, not the other way around." They looked at each other in the lamplight, the realization settling between them. "So neither of us knew about the other until yesterday," Temperance said slowly. Patrick nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Seems so." A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Temperance sipped her water, studying him over the rim of her cup. Without his hat, she could see his face more clearly, strong features, a small scar at his temple, dark hair that needed cutting. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way his brother might have been, but there was something compelling about him. "What will you do now?" she asked. "With the ranch. Same as I've been doing. Work it. Try to make it prosper." He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused. "Thomas had the dreams. I just have the determination." Something about his quiet resolve touched her. "It's a beautiful piece of land," she offered. For the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "You haven't seen much of it yet. Perhaps you could show me before I leave tomorrow." Patrick looked surprised, then nodded. "If you'd like." Temperance finished her water and set the cup aside. "Good night, Mr. Quaid." "Good night, Miss Taylor." As she climbed the stairs to her room, she wondered why the prospect of leaving in the morning suddenly felt more complicated than it had just hours before. Dawn broke clear and crisp, with the promise of a fine spring day. Temperance dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a blue cotton with a white collar, and pinned her dark blonde hair in a simple style. Through her window, she could see Patrick already at work, splitting wood with powerful strokes of an axe. He moved with efficiency despite his injured leg, and she found herself watching longer than was proper. After breakfast, while Mrs. Wilkes packed food for their journey to town, Patrick offered to show Temperance around the property as she'd requested. They walked first to the barn, where several fine horses peered curiously over their stall doors. "Thomas had a way with horses," Patrick explained, patting the nose of a chestnut mare. "Built up one of the best breeding programs in the county." "You don't share his interest?" Temperance asked. "I respect horses. Thomas loved them." He shrugged. "He always said my cattle were boring in comparison." Temperance smiled at that. "And what do you think? Cattle are predictable. Horses have opinions." For the second time, she saw the hint of a smile touch his lips. They continued their tour, Patrick pointing out the boundaries of the property, explaining his plans for expanding the herd and improving the water access. As he spoke, his reserve seemed to melt away, replaced by quiet enthusiasm for the land he clearly loved. They stopped at the top of a gentle rise, overlooking a creek that wound through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, mountains rose blue against the sky. "It's beautiful," Temperance said honestly. I can see why you love it here. Patrick nodded, looking out over his land. It's not Boston, though. No theaters or fancy shops. Boston has its charms, she agreed. But it also has too many memories now. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but something about the open landscape made her feel she could speak freely. Your parents? He asked quietly. Yes. Influenza took them both last winter. Our house had to be sold to pay their debts. She twisted her hands together. I was working as a companion to an elderly lady when I placed the advertisement. Patrick was silent for a moment. I'm sorry. They stood together, watching a hawk circle lazily above the meadow. The silence between them was companionable rather than awkward. We should head back, Patrick finally said. Long ride to town. As they walked toward the house, Temperance found herself searching for reasons to delay their departure. The thought of leaving this place and this man was becoming increasingly difficult, though she barely understood why. Mrs. Wilkes was waiting on the porch when they returned, her face troubled. Pastor Evans just sent word. The schoolteacher's family has had to leave suddenly. Their daughter in Denver had a baby early and needs help. They can't take Miss Taylor after all. Patrick frowned. Is there anyone else in town who could take her in? Mrs. Wilkes shook her head. Not right away. The hotel's full with cattle buyers in for the spring sales. Pastor Evans suggested she might stay at the church until other arrangements can be made. But she trailed off, looking uncomfortable. But what? Temperance asked. Well, dear, it wouldn't be very comfortable. Just a cot in the back room, and with Sunday services tomorrow. Mrs. Wilkes wrung her hands. Patrick was quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. She'll stay here, he finally said. Both women turned to him in surprise. Mr. Quaid, I couldn't possibly. Temperance began. Where else would you go? He asked bluntly. It's not proper, Mrs. Wilkes said, though without much conviction. A single woman staying alone with a bachelor. You could stay too, Patrick suggested. Just until we find somewhere suitable for Miss Taylor. Mrs. Wilkes looked torn. My husband needs me at home. The spring planting. They stood in uncomfortable silence, the dilemma hanging in the air between them. Finally, Temperance spoke. Perhaps there's another solution. She took a deep breath. I came here to be a wife and help run a ranch. The circumstances have changed, but my abilities haven't. What if I stayed on as your housekeeper, Mr. Quaid? Just until I earn enough for my return fare to Boston. Patrick's eyes widened slightly. You want to work for me? It would be a fair arrangement, she continued, warming to the idea. I can cook, clean, keep accounts. You'd have a properly run household, and I'd have a respectable position and a place to stay while I save money. Mrs. Wilkes looked thoughtful. It's not unheard of. The Hendersons over in Pine Valley have had a housekeeper for years. Of course, Mrs. Henderson is there too, but still. Patrick studied Temperance's face. You sure about this? Ranch life isn't easy. I came prepared to be a frontier wife, Mr. Quaid. I didn't expect an easy life. She lifted her chin. I'm stronger than I look. A long moment passed as he considered. All right, he finally said. Trial basis. 1 month. If either of us is unhappy with the arrangement, we'll find another solution. Agreed. Temperance felt a rush of relief, followed by a flutter of something else she couldn't quite identify. Well, Mrs. Wilkes clapped her hands together. That's settled then. I'll stay tonight to help Miss Taylor get situated properly, and I can come by every few days to check on things. As they turned to go inside, Temperance caught Patrick watching her with an unreadable expression. Their eyes held for a moment before he looked away, but it was enough to send an unexpected warmth through her chest. That evening after Mrs. Wilkes had retired, Temperance sat at the kitchen table working out a schedule of duties and a proposed wage with Patrick. He was fair in his negotiations, and she found herself impressed by his straightforward approach. "There's one more thing," she said as they finished. "I'd like Sundays off to attend church." Patrick nodded. "Fair enough. I usually go myself when work allows." "Oh," she was surprised. Thomas mentioned in his letters that he wasn't one for church-going. A shadow passed over Patrick's face. "Another difference between us." Temperance hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at her. "The letters I received. Did you write any of them?" Patrick looked uncomfortable. Thomas asked for help sometimes. Said he wasn't good with words. He shrugged. "I wrote what he told me to. Didn't know who they were for." "So some of the words were yours?" He nodded reluctantly. "Some." "Which parts?" She wasn't sure why it mattered, only that it did. Patrick stared at his hands. "The descriptions of the land, mostly. The hopes for what it could become." He looked up at her. "Thomas had the charm, but this place. This was always my dream more than his." Temperance thought about the letters she'd read over and over during her journey west. The parts that had moved her most had been the descriptions of the land and the quiet determination to build something lasting. She'd assumed those words came from a man like Thomas, outgoing and personable. Now she wondered if it was Patrick's steadiness that had drawn her across the country. "Thank you for your honesty," she said softly, "and for giving me this opportunity." He nodded, suddenly awkward. "Better get some rest. Mornings start early here." As Temperance climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a curious mix of emotions, uncertainty about the future, but also a strange sense of rightness, as if perhaps she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning marked the beginning of her new role. She rose before dawn, dressed in her simplest gown, and went downstairs to start breakfast. To her surprise, Patrick was already up, building a fire in the stove. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He shrugged. "Been doing it for years." They worked in companionable silence, Patrick showing her where things were kept while she mixed biscuit dough. By the time Mrs. Wilkes came downstairs, the kitchen was filled with the aroma of coffee and fresh baking. "My goodness," the older woman said, looking pleased. "You two have been busy." After breakfast, Mrs. Wilkes departed with promises to return in a few days, leaving Temperance alone with Patrick. There was an awkward moment as they stood on the porch watching Mrs. Wilkes's wagon disappear down the road. "I should get to work," Patrick finally said. "As should I," Temperance agreed, smoothing her apron. "Is there anything special you'd like for dinner?" He looked surprised by the question. "Whatever you make will be fine." As he walked toward the barn, Temperance watched the way he moved, purposeful despite his limp, with a quiet dignity that she found increasingly compelling. She shook her head, reminding herself that she was here as an employee, not a potential wife. No matter what strange flutter she felt when he looked at her, she needed to maintain professional boundaries. The days fell into a rhythm. Temperance rose early to prepare breakfast, spent the morning cleaning and organizing the house, made dinner at midday when Patrick came in from the fields, then used the afternoons for mending, baking, or working in the small kitchen garden. Patrick was always courteous, if reserved, and seemed appreciative of her efforts. One afternoon during her second week, Temperance was hanging laundry on the line when she noticed dark clouds building on the horizon. The air had gone still, with that heavy feeling that often preceded a storm. She hurried to finish her task, wanting to get the clothes dry before the rain came. As she pegged the last shirt to the line, a gust of wind nearly knocked her off balance. Looking up, she saw Patrick running toward her from the fields, his face grim. "Get inside!" he shouted over the rising wind. "Storm's coming fast." Temperance grabbed the empty basket and ran for the house, Patrick close behind her. They barely made it to the porch when the first fat raindrops began to fall. "Not just rain," Patrick said, scanning the sky. "See those clouds? Could be a tornado brewing." Temperance looked where he pointed and saw an ominous greenish tint to the clouds. "Should we go to the cellar?" Patrick nodded. "Better safe than sorry. I need to secure the horses first." Before she could protest, he was running toward the barn, fighting against the wind that was now bending the trees almost double. Temperance hurried inside to gather a few necessities: blankets, a lamp, matches. Through the window, she could see the storm advancing rapidly, a curtain of rain and hail sweeping across the fields. The sky had darkened to an eerie twilight, and a constant rumble of thunder shook the house. When Patrick still hadn't returned after 10 minutes, she began to worry. The storm was directly overhead now, rain lashing the windows and hail pounding the roof like fists. Making a decision, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and ventured out onto the porch. "Patrick!" she shouted, but her voice was lost in the howl of the wind. Squinting through the downpour, she could just make out the barn. The door was swinging wildly, banging against the wall with each gust. Of Patrick, there was no sign. Fear gripped her as she imagined him injured, perhaps struck by falling debris or kicked by a panicked horse. Taking a deep breath, she dashed from the porch toward the barn, slipping in the mud and nearly falling several times. By the time she reached the barn door, she was soaked to the skin and shivering. "Patrick!" she called again as she entered the dimness of the barn. A crash of thunder shook the building, and several horses whinnied in fear. Temperance moved deeper into the barn, checking each stall. She found Patrick in the last one, struggling to calm the chestnut mare, who was rearing and kicking in panic. "What are you doing here?" he shouted when he saw her. "Get back to the house." "I was worried," she explained, approaching cautiously. "Can I help?" Before he could answer, a deafening crack split the air, and part of the barn roof tore away. Rain poured in, and the mare reared again, eyes rolling in terror. Patrick pushed Temperance out of the stall just as the horse's hooves came down, missing him by inches. "The storm cellar," he ordered, grabbing her hand. "Now!" They ran from the barn hand in hand, hunched against the fury of the storm. The wind was so strong it nearly lifted Temperance off her feet, and only Patrick's firm grip kept her grounded. They reached the storm cellar behind the house, and Patrick wrenched the doors open, guiding her down the steps before following and pulling the doors shut behind them. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the storm's fury. Temperance stood dripping on the dirt floor, trying to catch her breath as Patrick lit the lamp she'd brought earlier. "You shouldn't have come after me," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only concern. "Could have been killed." "I was worried," she repeated, shivering now from cold and reaction. "You were gone so long." Patrick looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he reached for one of the blankets and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're soaked through," he said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Here." He guided her to sit on a crate, then took another blanket for himself. They sat in the dim cellar, listening to the storm rage overhead. Occasionally the whole structure would shake with a particularly strong gust or crack of thunder, and each time, Patrick would glance at the ceiling as if gauging its strength. "Will the house be all right?" Temperance asked. "Built it solid," he answered. "Should withstand most anything. Barn might need repairs, though." She nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Despite it, she couldn't stop shivering. Patrick noticed. "You're freezing." He hesitated, then moved to sit beside her on the crate, putting an arm around her shoulders. "Body heat," he explained awkwardly. "Best way to warm up." Temperance knew she should protest the impropriety, but the solid warmth of him was too comforting to refuse. She found herself leaning into his side, her head coming to rest against his shoulder. "Thank you," she murmured. They sat in silence for a time, the only sounds the storm above and their breathing in the small space. Temperance gradually stopped shivering, becoming aware instead of the steady beat of Patrick's heart under her ear and the gentle strength of his arm around her. "Why did you really come west?" Patrick asked suddenly. "Truth now." Temperance considered deflecting the question, but something about their situation sheltering together while the world raged outside made honesty feel right. "After my parents died, I had few options," she admitted. "I could continue as a companion, which meant living at the mercy of others' whims. I could try to find work as a shopgirl, which barely pays enough to survive. Or I could marry." She sighed. There were no suitable prospects in Boston, not for a woman without family connections or fortune. "So you decided to marry a stranger instead?" "I decided to take control of my destiny," she corrected. "The West offered a chance to build something of my own, to be valued for my contributions rather than my connections." She looked up at him. Your letters spoke of partnership, of building something lasting together." "That's what I wanted." Patrick's expression softened. "That's what I've always wanted too." The simple honesty in his voice made her heart beat faster. For a moment, they simply looked at each other in the lamplight, something unspoken passing between them. The moment was broken by a particularly violent crash overhead, followed by a splintering sound. Patrick tensed, listening intently. "That sounded like a tree coming down," he said. "Hope it wasn't the big oak by the house." "How long do these storms usually last?" Temperance asked. "Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be all night." He shifted slightly but didn't remove his arm from around her shoulders. "Might as well get comfortable." As the storm continued to rage, they truly talked for the first time. Patrick told her about growing up on the ranch with Thomas, about their parents who had died within a year of each other when the brothers were in their teens, about his time in the war and the injury that had nearly cost him his leg. Temperance shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her love of books, her dreams of someday having a family of her own. "Do you regret answering the advertisement?" Patrick asked after a lull in the conversation. "Now that you know it wasn't what you thought?" Temperance considered the question carefully. "I regret the deception," she said finally. "And I grieve for Thomas, even though I never truly knew him. But—" she hesitated. "I don't regret coming here." Something in Patrick's face changed, a softening around his eyes. "I'm glad," he said simply. Eventually, the storm began to subside, the crashes of thunder growing more distant and the wind lessening its howl to a moan. When it had been quiet for some time, Patrick reluctantly removed his arm from around Temperance's shoulders. "Should be safe to go back to the house now," he said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. She took it, aware of the calluses on his palm and the gentle strength in his grip. As he helped her up, they stood close together in the small space, their faces just inches apart. For a breathless moment, Temperance thought he might kiss her. Instead, he stepped back and reached for the cellar doors. "Let's see what damage we're dealing with," he said, pushing the doors open to reveal a world washed clean by the rain. The oak tree had indeed fallen, but it had missed the house, landing instead across the garden. The barn had lost part of its roof, as Patrick had suspected, but the horses inside appeared unharmed. The house itself had weathered the storm well, though the front porch railing had been damaged by flying debris. "Could have been worse," Patrick said as they surveyed the property. "We got lucky. We'll need to fix the barn roof before it rains again," Temperance said, then blushed at her presumption. "I mean, you will." Patrick looked at her with something like amusement. He corrected. "If you're staying." "I'm staying," she confirmed. surprised by how certain she felt about it. They worked side by side for the rest of the day, salvaging what they could from the garden, checking on the animals, and making temporary repairs to the barn roof. By the time they returned to the house, exhausted but satisfied with their progress, something had shifted between them. The awkwardness of employer and employee had given way to something more like partnership. As they sat at the kitchen table that evening, eating a simple meal of bread and stew, Patrick looked up suddenly. "I'm glad you're here, Temperance," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Not just because of the help. It's good not to be alone." The simple admission touched her deeply. "I'm glad too, Patrick." They smiled at each other across the table, and Temperance felt a warm glow of possibility unfurl within her heart. The days following the storm were busy ones. Word spread quickly about the damage to the Quaid ranch, and neighbors came to help with repairs. Temperance was touched by the community spirit as men arrived with tools and lumber, while women brought food and offers of assistance. She found herself working alongside the other women, cooking for the workers and getting to know her neighbors. Several commented on how nice it was to see the Quaid place coming back to life, with curtains in the windows and flowers on the table. "Patrick's changed since you came," Mrs. Wilkes confided as they rolled pie crust together. "He seems less burdened somehow." "I've only been here a short time," Temperance protested. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The older woman smiled knowingly. "The right person can change everything." Temperance wasn't sure how to respond to that. She and Patrick had settled into a comfortable routine, and she enjoyed his company more each day, but neither had spoken of anything beyond their current arrangement. Still, she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever he smiled at her or the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally touched. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Temperance was sitting on the newly repaired porch, enjoying the cool breeze after a hot day. Patrick joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her and sat in the chair beside hers, stretching his injured leg out in front of him with a slight grimace. "Leg bothering you?" she asked. "Always does after a long day." He sipped his coffee. "Worth it, though. Barn's finally fixed proper." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Fireflies began to appear, drifting like floating embers across the yard. "Our month is almost up," Patrick said suddenly. "The trial period we agreed on." Temperance's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, I suppose it is." "Are you still planning to return to Boston?" She looked out at the land she'd come to love, the gently rolling hills, the creek shimmering in the distance, the barn and corrals that now felt like home. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I've been happy here." Patrick nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "I've been thinking about what happens next." "Oh." She tried to keep her voice casual, though her heart was racing. "I'd like you to stay," he said, turning to look at her directly. "Not as a housekeeper." Temperance's breath caught in her throat. "What then?" Patrick set his coffee cup aside and took her hand in his. "I know it's not what you came here for. I'm not Thomas with his easy charm. I'm quieter, more set in my ways. But these weeks with you—" He paused, searching for words. "You've brought light back to this place. Back to me." "Patrick," she began, but he continued, as if afraid he'd lose his courage if he stopped. "I'm asking if you'd consider staying as my wife." He squeezed her hand gently. "Not right away. We could have a proper courtship first, do things right. But I want you to know that's what I'm hoping for." Temperance looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. In his eyes, she saw honesty, respect, and something else, something that made her heart swell with answering emotion. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'd like that very much." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Patrick leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Temperance responded, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they drew apart, both a little breathless, Patrick touched her cheek with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted softly. "After the war, I figured I'd live out my days alone. Then Thomas brought you here, though he never knew what a gift he was giving me." "Perhaps he did know," Temperance suggested. In his own way, Patrick considered this. Maybe Thomas always could see things the rest of us missed. He looked toward the distant ridge where his brother was buried. "I'd like to think he'd be happy about this." "I think he would be," Temperance said. "He wanted this place to thrive. He wanted you to be happy." They sat together as twilight deepened into night, making plans and sharing hopes, their hands remaining intertwined. When they finally went inside, something fundamental had changed. Temperance was no longer a housekeeper working for her keep, but a woman choosing her future, choosing Patrick. The courtship Patrick proposed began the very next day. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, asked her opinion on ranch decisions, and each evening they would sit on the porch, talking and learning more about each other. On Sundays, they rode to church together, their growing attachment noticed and approved by the community. Mrs. Wilkes continued to visit regularly, providing a nod to propriety while offering Temperance friendship and guidance. "You two are good for each other," she declared after observing them together. "Like two pieces of a puzzle that fit just right." As spring gave way to summer, the ranch flourished under their combined care. Patrick worked from dawn to dusk on the land, while Temperance transformed the house into a true home. She planted a larger garden, canned vegetables for the winter, and even began teaching herself about horse breeding from the books Thomas had collected. One warm July evening, Patrick returned from town with a small package, which he presented to Temperance after dinner. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Open it and see," he replied, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Inside the box was a simple gold ring set with a small pearl. Temperance looked up at Patrick, her heart in her throat. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've been having it cleaned and sized in town." He took a deep breath. "I know we agreed to a proper courtship, but I can't wait any longer, Temperance. I love you. Will you marry me?" Tears of happiness filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Patrick slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in town, with Mrs. Wilkes beaming in the front pew and the entire community gathered to celebrate. Temperance wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Patrick had insisted on ordering from Denver, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. "I take thee, Temperance, to be my wedded wife," Patrick vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." As Temperance repeated the same vows, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west to marry a man she'd never met, only to find him dead and a coffin waiting. Instead, she had found Patrick steady, honorable Patrick who had become the center of her world. After the ceremony, the entire community gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing, with Patrick surprising everyone by leading Temperance in a waltz despite his injured leg. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" she asked, laughing as he twirled her around the yard. "Had lessons as a boy," he admitted with a grin. "Ma insisted both her sons be proper gentlemen." He pulled her closer. "Never thought I'd have cause to use those lessons again." As the last guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone, Temperance felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Patrick seemed to sense it, for he took her hand and led her not toward the house but to the top of the rise overlooking the creek, the spot he'd first shown her when she arrived. In the moonlight, the landscape was transformed into a silver tapestry, beautiful and serene. Patrick wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, secure in his embrace. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He turned her in his arms to face him. "I want you to know something, Temperance. I may not say it as often as I should, but I'll show you every day how much I love you. This land, this life, it's ours now. Together." Temperance reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar at his temple, the curve of his mouth that smiled more often now. "I love you, Patrick Quaid. I'm glad I found my way to you, even if it wasn't the path I expected." Their kiss beneath the stars sealed a promise that both knew would last a lifetime. The seasons turned, and the Quaid ranch prospered under their care. Patrick's cattle business expanded, while Temperance continued Thomas's horse breeding program with unexpected success. Their first foal sold at auction brought a price that had Patrick whistling for days afterward. "You have a gift," he told her proudly. "Thomas would have been impressed." "I had a good teacher," she replied, patting the book of horse lineages she'd studied so diligently. "And good stock to work with." By their first anniversary, Temperance was expecting their first child, a development that filled Patrick with equal parts joy and terror. He hovered protectively, insisting she rest more and lift less, until she finally had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. "Not my wife," he countered. "Not my child." His concern touched her deeply, even when it bordered on overprotectiveness. Each night, he would place his hand on her growing belly, marveling at the movements of their child within. "Strong," he would say with satisfaction, "like its mother." Their daughter, Elizabeth and Quaid, was born on a snowy December morning with Mrs. Wilkes and the town doctor in attendance. Patrick paced the hallway for hours, then wept unabashedly when the doctor finally placed the tiny bundle in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, sitting beside Temperance on the bed, "just like her mother." As Elizabeth grew, so did the ranch and their happiness. Patrick built a proper nursery adjoining their bedroom, and later a small schoolroom where Temperance could teach their daughter. The house expanded along with their family, with a larger kitchen and a proper study where they could work on the ranch accounts together in the evenings. Their second child, a son they named Michael Thomas Quaid, arrived 2 years after Elizabeth. Patrick was even more protective during this pregnancy, having seen Temperance's struggle with the first birth. When Michael emerged easily after just a few hours of labor, Patrick's relief was palpable. "Two perfect children," he said, cradling his son while Elizabeth peered curiously at her new brother. "How did I get so lucky?" "I ask myself the same question every day," Temperance replied, reaching for his hand. "Life wasn't always easy. There were drought years when the creek ran low and the cattle grew thin. There was the winter Elizabeth developed pneumonia, leaving them all sleepless for days until the fever broke. There was the fire that destroyed part of the barn, requiring another community effort to rebuild. Through it all, Patrick and Temperance faced each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. They worked side by side during the day and held each other close at night, their love deepening in ways neither had imagined possible. 10 years after Temperance stepped down from that stagecoach to find a coffin waiting, the Quaid Ranch was known throughout the territory for its fine horses and healthy cattle. Patrick's limp was more pronounced now, especially in cold weather, but he remained as hardworking as ever. Temperance had become a respected member of the community, serving on the school board and organizing a lending library in town. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Patrick surprised Temperance by taking her to the rise overlooking the creek, their special place. A picnic was laid out on a blanket, with a bottle of wine and a small cake that Elizabeth had helped bake in secret. 10 years, Patrick marveled as they sat together, watching their children play by the water's edge. Sometimes it seems like yesterday you arrived, and sometimes it feels like I've been here my whole life, Temperance replied, leaning against his shoulder. Patrick wrapped an arm around her. Do you ever regret it? Coming west? Staying? Temperance looked at the life they'd built together, their beautiful children, their thriving ranch, the love that had grown between them day by day, year by year. Never, she said with absolute certainty. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. With you. Patrick kissed her then, with all the tenderness and passion that had only deepened with time. I thank God every day for bringing you to me, he murmured against her lips, even if it was in the strangest way possible. They both looked toward the ridge where Thomas was buried, his grave now marked with a proper headstone and always kept neat with fresh flowers. In an odd way, they both felt grateful to him for the deception that had brought Temperance west, for the circumstances that had thrown her and Patrick together. To Thomas, Patrick said, raising his wine glass, may he rest in peace, knowing his ranch and his brother are in good hands. To Thomas, Temperance echoed, and to us. As the sun began to set, painting the landscape in the same golden hues Temperance had first admired a decade ago, Patrick pulled something from his pocket, a small box wrapped in silver paper. What's this? She asked, surprised. Open it, he encouraged. Inside was a locket on a delicate gold chain. When she opened it, she found a tiny portrait of their family on one side, and on the other, an inscription. To T, from P. Forever yours. Oh, Patrick, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. It's beautiful. Like you, he said simply, helping her fasten it around her neck. Happy anniversary, my love. As they gathered their children and walked back to the house hand in hand, Temperance thought about the young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 10 years ago, filled with trepidation at the sight of a coffin. She could never have imagined the happiness that awaited her, the love she would find with the quiet man who had asked her to stay. The mail order bride had arrived to find a coffin waiting. The cowboy had said, "You'll stay with me," and in that moment of uncertainty and fate, a love story had begun that would last a lifetime.